Hello, 8th grade. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 4, Lesson 3, Culture and Society of Our Colonies. So, as we follow along here, make sure you're in the right spot in your packet of notes. We're going to talk about life in the colonies, primarily the growth of our colonies. Immigration and the desire to have large families contributed to the growth in the colonies as far as population growth is concerned. Between the years 1700 and maybe about the mid 1700s, so about the 1750s, population in the colonies grew from about 250,000 people, which is about a quarter of a million people, to over 2.5 million people. This included in the increase of about 50,000 African Americans who were brought here primarily as enslaved labor. If you take a look at the pie graph down below, you can see that just a little shy of 50% of all of our uh, immigrants that were coming to the Americas were probably of an English background. And if you look over to the right, you can see that just a little shy of 8% are Irish, uh, not quite 7% are Scottish, and then you have a number of German immigrants, just a few French immigrants. But if you compare that to about 20% of the individuals coming here were African, that's a pretty big chunk if you start adding those numbers up. If you look at the map on the right hand side of the screen, this is kind of telling you a little bit about the regions that some of these different ethnic groups were settling. So if you're looking at individuals that kind of have an English background, areas in New England, a little bit along the Atlantic seaboard and in the middle colonies and into the southern colonies, you're going to see quite a few people with an English background. When we look at our Africans who are brought here, areas near the James River and New York River in Virginia had large settlements or numbers of Africans that were brought there probably to work in tobacco fields and such. And then if you look further into the Carolinas, down the coast to Georgia as well. Although the colonies were relatively healthy places to live, life was still pretty fragile. Little things could pop up. I mean, issues with water supply could lead to diseases, but there were some diseases that were a little bit more prevalent, and it could lead to what we would call an epidemic, meaning that there were a large number of people that would either come down with the illness or, worse yet, die from the illness. In the year 1721, 15% of the city of Boston died from smallpox, which, might not necessarily, when you think about the numbers, might not seem all that big today, but that's a large number of the people who were currently living there. People in our colonies, when we talk about roles in everyday life, when you talk about the family, I mean, that was kind of like the center of life during this era of time. A father would be not only the head of the household, but he would manage maybe a farm. He also represented the family in the community. So if his wife or children would do something that was not necessarily very respectable, dad usually took the heat for that. So he kind of ran a tight ship. There was, a lot of discipline in the family so that the image of the family would be good. Mom would run the household as far as day to day items. Mom would also care for the children that were being raised. If you were a young man living in the household, you would probably help on the farm. You might also be kind of in a servant role to your father. Or you might, if you weren't necessarily the farming type, uh, go off and learn a skill via being an apprentice. Some very well known colonial Americans like Ben Franklin, that's kind of how he gets his start in the printing industry, is he was an apprentice to his older brothers. Young women or women who are widowed, they might work as a maid, a cook, perhaps a teacher, a nurse, or maybe even a seamstress. And depending on the situation, they might even run a business, probably with a spouse, or if a spouse has passed away, a widowed woman might carry on the business in her own name. Some beliefs that you might see in the American colonies. Education was highly valued by many of the people in the colonies. In 1647, the first public education law was passed by Massachusetts Puritans. Colonists in New England and Pennsylvania wanted people to be able to study the Bible. Because of this, literacy rates in New England were really high. In the middle colonies, widows and unmarried women ran private schools. Craftspeople set up schools for apprentices, and colleges were established, founded primarily to train ministers. So even schools like Harvard University had a seminary. Might not necessarily be the case for a lot of public universities that would come years later, but there's been this tie between church and religion for a number of years, and it's not necessarily from a Catholic religious perspective. Other things that were important, there was a strong religious desire to kind of get back to the old ways. And we have this event known as the Great Awakening that's going to take place in the 1730s into the 1740s. And Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield were two preachers from New England that wanted to help spread this revival. Many new churches were founded. These churches emphasized personal faith rather than church ritual. And if you look at like the Church of England, you look at the Catholic Church, I mean, there's a lot of rituals that are within their services. The Great Awakening probably emphasized more of Bible study, memorization, and that sort of thing. Maybe even emphasis on singing songs in a kind of community setting as well. Other things that were going on. The Enlightenment, which started in Europe before this period of time, but put a great emphasis on the value of knowledge, reason, and science. And people in the colonies developed a very strong interest in studying nature and began experimenting. Probably one of the more famous scientists to come out of the Enlightenment era in the United States was a guy named Benjamin Franklin. But even founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson were kind of known for dabbling in science a little bit. The case of Jonathan Peter Zenger, who was a German immigrant who was involved in the printing industry. He actually was, if my memory serves me correct, printed a newspaper in New York, and he brought about this issue of freedom of the press to the public's attention. And it kind of starts when his paper runs a very critical editorial of the governor of New York at that period of time. And the governor of New York wanted to shut down Zenger's newspaper. Colonists really started to begin to value this idea of freedom. And when Zenger's case went to the courts back in the colonial era, he won. And it kind of sets this precedent in American history that we're going to support the idea that people can say what they want in the printed form. He had actually been accused of libel, saying something in his newspaper that the governor thought was wrong. So, the democratic ideas and practices and values known as civic virtue were being put into action during this period of time and would become kind of the basis of our country. Benjamin Franklin. As I mentioned before, he was kind of a man of the Enlightenment, a little bit of science, but he was also a guy who dabbled in a lot of other things. He was a self-made man. He owned newspapers. He had been an apprentice as a child to his older brothers. He learned the printing industry, and then he fled Boston to Philadelphia, where he started publishing his own paper, and eventually the Poor Richard's Almanac, which was basically something that people pretty much lived by during the colonial times, kind of a precursor to what we would call the Farmer's Almanac today. He also made scientific discoveries. If you remember, the story of him and the kite and the key, and he kind of discovered lightning. He also invented the lightning rod. He founded the hospital, the University of Pennsylvania, becomes part of this, established a fire department, began a library. So this is a jack of all trades, so to speak. As a patriot, he helped guide the colonies to independence, and is probably a man that, even though he was never really holding an elected office, becomes really important when you talk about the founding of our country and the writing of our Constitution, particularly. Thank you very much.